Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first ever episode of the Global Guessing Weekly podcast. My name is Clay Graubard, and I am joined with my co-host Andrew Eady. Every week, Andrew and I plan to hold conversations about all things forecasting, ranging from interviews with forecasting experts to discussions about some of our latest predictions on our website. In today's inaugural episode, we are pleased to be sitting down with author, professor, and renowned geopolitical forecaster, Dr. Balkan Devlen. Dr. Devlen first earned his BA in International Relations and Affairs from Middle Eastern Technical University in Turkey before earning his PhD in Political Science and Government from the University of Missouri-Columbia.
Dr. Devlen has taught at the Izmir University of Economics in Turkey and the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. Dr. Devlen is currently a senior fellow at the MacDonald Laurier Institute, a Canadian public policy think tank, and is also the director of the Center in Modern Turkish Studies at Carleton University in Ontario, Canada. Devlen is also a superforecaster for Good Judgement Inc. and the author of a geopolitical forecasting Substack called Hindsight 2020. You should all subscribe to after listening to this episode. We could say a lot more about him, but we have to get to our questions. So without further ado, welcome, Dr.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
We'd like to...
go ahead.
Yeah, we'd just like to start off with your background and how you first got started in forecasting. And so could you talk to us about how you first got introduced to the world of quantified forecasting and what really drew you into the practice?
Sure. One of the reasons why I went on to study international relations back in mid-1990s was to have a better sense of how rapid changes in the world are going to affect us all. So it was about thinking about the future. This is the time, massive changes were happening in Europe and elsewhere. I was growing up and going through college when the Yugoslav wars of succession were going on in Bosnia and elsewhere, and genocide in Rwanda and all other places. So the idea of trying to understand these rapid changes and uncertainties in the future was the one thing that drive me to international relations. And of course, with a lot of people who are in a similar position, I was very much interested in science fiction and thinking about the future more broadly. But one thing that throughout the university and later on throughout graduate school is the lack of rigor in thinking about the future. And maybe perhaps we can talk this later on, and the misaligned incentive structures that one can see about accurately predicting or thinking about the future versus just what Ted Law called vague verbiage, right? So I was always thinking about how we can think in a more rigorous way about the future and try to sort of help thinking about the future in this way to structure our actions today. When the first ACE tournament, IARPA's ACE tournament for the geopolitical forecasting was announced, I saw it in a email group back in 2010 or 11 at the time. Through an email by Philip Tetlow, which part of my academic interest was political psychology, especially the role of individual policymakers. And I was always interested in bringing, game theory together with political psychology to understand how people behave and what they could do. So I was very much aware of Philip Tetlow's work on cognitive complexity and other things. So when I saw that email, I wanted to apply initially. But for the first season, they only accepted American citizens, part of the requirement by IARPA. They open up later on in the second season, so I got in to be part of it later on, and then became a Superforecaster in the third season, I believe, and maintained that in the last season of Good Judgement. The primary reason why I wanted to do that was the ACE tournament, in which Good Judgement came on top, provides me with an opportunity to test my models of the world in real time. Right? It provides feedback and quiet, harsh feedback in terms of how I think the world works, right? And for me, that was the biggest attraction. Here is a tournament, a system in which I can throw away how I think about the world and how things would evolve, and I can get feedback almost immediately. And in academic work, as you guys know, it's you write about things in about maybe for 10, 20, 15 years later on, and it's not really an immediate feedback loop. So the way that you can correct is a lot slow, and that's not necessarily incentive structure at any rate. So that was my primary motivation. It enables me to test whether the way I think about the world is actually accurate, and would it help me to make decisions later on. And when I'm wrong, I can go back and look, right? Why was I wrong? Was I wrong in terms of outcome for the right reasons? Or do I happen to get lucky and got the prediction right, but for the wrong reasons, right? So that level of keeping yourself honest and testing your models in real time over a very broad set of questions. I think we answered 400 questions or 500 questions overall in the ACE tournament. Give you a good sense of where your weaknesses are, where your blind spots are. So that was my primary motivation in getting involved with Good Judgement, and my involvement continued afterwards when the commercial spin-off came out of that tournament.
You mentioned your thesis just now. Clay and I actually had a chance to give a brief look at your thesis. We were able to find it online, which is interesting. And you talk about game theory within the context of renegade regimes, which is very interesting for us as two people who have studied a good amount of theory. We were wondering, in what way does game theory sort of impact the work that you do today? How does it interact with forecasting? You sort of talk about this live feedback. Is forecasting a way to sort of operationalize that game theory that you utilize in your thesis, or what's the relationship there?
No, very good question. In terms of the practical day-to-day, when I answer questions for the judgment and similar platforms, I very rarely do any sort of explicit modeling with regards to the game theory today. But how it informs me, I think, is more about the way I'd like to think about actions and decisions. In that sense, game theory is a very powerful tool because it forces you to focus on two things. It forces you to think about the incentive structure in a given domain, and from the structure, from the environment, drive certain predictions that you can see whether it can work or not. So in a way, it's more of an intuitive or implicit use of game theory in most of my work. When I do, I tend to think, okay, so what could be the, if I am in that person's shoes, and if I think about my preference ordering over a set of outcomes in this particular domain, how would I order that? And if I order that, how, what would affect my ordering? It will be the incentive structures, where I will maximize my utility. And that utility doesn't have to be material; it could be ideological and other things. And if I think that is the model, and that gives me the opportunity to say whether that is a correct and accurate representation of that entity, that actor's preference ordering. And if that is correct, how would they act? Right. And most of it is not done necessarily, like I said, in a paper and pen format. I don't draw the game trees and whatnot, but it gives me a sense of trying to think from the outcomes that I want to achieve and moving backwards, what I would do if that was my end goal, and then structure it that way in a sub-game perfect equilibrium sort of structure. Not necessarily in a formal way, but so working through game theory in my dissertation and later on provide me with that sort of mindset in approaching things primarily.
And then sort of building on top of that, is that the sort of same way that you approach incorporating IR theory into forecast relating to geopolitics? We were talking about earlier, you were mentioning how IR lacks these sort of rigorous checks. And I'm just wondering if part of that has to do with like theory formalization, right? Waltz talks about how we're not worried about outcomes. We're just talking about, general changes in behavior based on like third level conditions and et cetera. So if there are limitations to how IR can be brought into theory. And if you do bring in theory, could you maybe give us an example of a prediction and how theory was used to help you formulate the outcome?
The way I use IR theory, I'm a self-declared realist, or at least a classical realist, increasingly more on the classical side rather than on the neo side. The more I think and work through stuff. But the way I tend to bring it in is this more sort of broad background understanding of the general dynamics in the world. In other words, when I rely on IR theory, right? Be the realist thinking or others. I tend to take that as providing the constraining elements of a particular domain in geopolitics, rather than using IR theory to derive specific predictions about that issue. Now we can do that with more middle range theorizing. There's a lot of the neoclassical realist work tries to do that, or some of the more specific rationalist theories, from bargaining and so on and so forth, which then you can use. But to me, the way I use it as more of a worldview component, what I think matters in international affairs. That is the theoretical component in my worldview, in the way I understand and look at things. That's generally shaped by realism, in the sense that power plays a central role. When push comes to the shove, it will eventually depend on conflict groups and one group's ability to harm others in a very physical sense. So in that sort of understanding of the world, the civilization is a quite thin veneer, and maintaining sort of a tragic, and it doesn't necessarily have to be intentional sort of evil sort of structure that people go to war or conflict, but the incentives, the presence of security dilemma, the reality of group identities, how we identify ourselves and our interests, therefore provides an opportunity to understand what are the fundamental dynamics or immutable dynamics of international politics. And from there, I make certain predictions and forecasts based on that. So IR theory, in that sense, plays the background constraining framework for me to look what matters when you're making a decision, and what would matter eventually for the outcomes. And for my students, and I'm going to wrap up here in this way, for my students, I generally give the example of Liechtenstein. I don't want to pick on Liechtenstein in any shape or form, but the leaders of Liechtenstein, the Duke or the Prince, whoever, would have world domination fantasies. They will never do that because they don't have the capabilities to achieve such an outcome. Well, if you're talking about Germany or Russia or China or United States, well, that's a different story, right? They have the capabilities to achieve that. And that way of looking at it, whether you actually have the capabilities to do things that you want to do, provides you the what is plausible, what is possible, and therefore how you should constrain your probable outcomes out there.
So then does that change based on the actor that you're looking at? So if the primary actor is the European Union, are you shifting in the foundational theories you're using then if, say, you're looking at a conflict between, say, strategic partnership between Russia and China? Does that underlying theory where the range of outcomes, does that change? Because I had a professor who always made sure to say there's no such thing as realists, there's just practitioners of realism. Theory doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is people implementing theory that actually matters. And so therefore, does that have an effect based on the actor you're looking at, which theories you're considering?
Exactly. No,
Okay.
I totally agree with that. And again, I tend to see realism as more of a disposition rather than a coherent set of either Kuhnian or Lakatoshian understanding of connected propositions and hypotheses and axioms and so on and so forth. I tend to see it as more of a disposition. And I think Richard Nedlabov puts it quite nicely. It's a tragic disposition in the sense that, despite your best efforts, bad things happen, and it doesn't necessarily need to have any reason or rhyme. And that it's a more of a circular understanding and so on and so forth. So it's a disposition about things can get bad because there are power struggles, and there will always be one among groups and so on and so forth. When you come to the specific issue, then you would start switching between what works as a tool in understanding how you can solve that problem. Right. So for me, it's a lot more useful to say, look at various governance debates, say, I don't know, from intergovernmentalism to supranationalism and so on and so forth, to understand the specific dynamics within EU than just to impose some other external theory that would not necessarily make sense there. So those are tools. Those are tools that you reach out to make sense of what is going on. But it always comes with a particular disposition, I think, and people who tend to have a more liberal disposition in the IR theory sense would see more opportunities for cooperation, while people like me tends to be always looking in the shadows and see what kind of threats lurking there. And then I think that's a lot to do with personality, with upbringing, with the intellectual journey that you come through, and so on and so forth. But those are more background conditions. Mm-hmm. And the way I approach the theory is not really different than different methods that I reach out to understand the problem, be it a quantitative work, could be game theory, could be in-depth ethnographic work, depending on what works in that specific circumstance.
Great.
So, as you mentioned before, Petlock superforecasting was our introduction into sort of the forecasting space. And most of our exposure to forecasting in general has been somewhat US-centric. Something that we found really interesting about your background is that you've operated in Canada and Denmark, Turkey, the United States. Has that geographic context at all altered the work that you do? Do you see some areas have different approaches to forecasting or a different level of acceptance to sort of these novel forecasting methods in other geographic contexts?
Yes. Well, maybe two things there. The US is definitely sort of on the leading edge of this. And there's a reason why a lot of these things are being funded by various US government agencies. I mean, let me put it this way: in a majority of the places, thinking about the future is generally in a bunch of guys coming around a table and talking, if it happens at all. And so it's not necessarily an institutionalized way of doing it. It's generally winging it. Because the payoffs are not there for the majority of the people who need to think about this. US, in that sense, is a different ballgame. And that has a lot to do, I believe, with the specific people who are involved in the IARPA and the DARPA organizations that actually push for this. Because still, even in the US, when you look at the government level or the bureaucratic level, accurate forecasts are not, up there in terms of priority. Things are changing, though. For example, in Europe, there's a recent commission-wide report that basically put foresight into sort of a central component of European Union decisions going forward. There's a vice commissioner for foresight in Europe, part of the European Commission. Now, the way they understand foresight is a bit different. I find it a bit wishy-washy in the sense that it's about plausible, but it is still a step. It's a step to try to think in a more disciplined way about different alternatives out there and how we can anticipate and change. And the idea is not you forecast. I mean, for me, I just do it because I want to see whether my model works. But for practitioners, you want to anticipate so you can take the actions to alter the trajectory in your advantage. So that is coming back. That is coming back in big time in Europe as well. But in Turkey, it almost non-existent. I was one of the handful of non-Americans that end up qualifying as a Superforecaster through the IARPA's competition. It was like, I think 85% of participants were Americans as well. But now, for example, we have a broader, diverse group within Good Judgement, people from everywhere, increasingly. So I think that brings a lot of useful perspectives, and it served me well in several questions to have a different perspective.
Do you think part of changing that, how much attention is given to foresight, is in part due to how academia is structured, particularly looking at how what is considered for acceptable theses? You're always told, do things in the past, look backwards, has to be 5, 10, 20 years in the past. I've personally always, like for undergrad, I wanted to focus on automation and artificial intelligence and how that would impact the international space, but that's forward looking, and so therefore is not the right place to do that kind of research. And given that most people don't get PhDs and then have time to make papers on their side, do you think that part of it is also just what's considered the bounds of acceptable academic research for everyone that doesn't have a tenure position and can make whatever journal articles they can, assuming they have an endowed fellowship and all of those additional things as well? I don't know if you've given thought to that as being a potential.
I think that's definitely one of the things. I mean, when you look at it, academia is one of the most conservative institutions in the world in terms of structure, small c conservative. We're essentially moving forward with a modified version of the medieval guild that is filtered through sort of the German understanding of what a university is in the 19th century. Still the same sort of ways of thinking and organization, right? So it is still a very, very slow to change structure and incentives. I keep coming back to it. I mean, if one thing that I get out of my education and background in economics and several things that I did is incentives is what matters fundamentally, right? I mean, most of these contemporary economics is about incentives and incentive design and mechanism design and all that kind of thing. And academia and incentives are not necessarily about being, especially in social sciences, about predicting in the future, being accurate. That's not, because that's not who you're talking to. You're talking to other academics who are doing similar work. So it's more about the minute detail of a particular case or not. So it's the emphasis is more on looking back, explanation, on understanding, and an aversion, to be honest, within the social sciences, broadly speaking, about making a claim, making a claim that you can be falsified later on. Because if you speak in very broad terms, balances will be formed. When, how, where, who knows? They will eventually. You cannot be falsified, and you're not being rewarded for being accurate, right? I mean, John Mersheimer's 1990s articles are a great example. You could be, again and again,
or Huntington.
Exactly, or Huntington. You could be wrong again and again. That never just sort of impact your credibility in the field. So people don't go there. There's no incentive. There's no upside for risking, accurate predictions, because it is, you don't gain much when you're right. So what's the point? But looking backwards is how it is generally structured, and it's very, very hard to break it. I mean, certain fields are different. AI, in that sense, you're in an actually perfect, maybe Swiss spot that would enable you to think through, because it is one of those areas in which people think very carefully about the future. And UK has at least two great centers on existential risk, and AI plays a huge role in it. Both the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford, as well as this Caesar in Cambridge, the Center for Study of Existential Risk. And in that field, anticipating the future is the primary purpose. So there is a lot more rigorous and careful work being done there. And interestingly enough, a lot of it is coming from both philosophy and more engineering and mathematical backgrounds. Very little, unfortunately, social sciences. But things are changing slowly in the past maybe 5 years. It really picked up. But there is, it's very, very slow change, but it's still a very minuscule aspect of what academia does and what it rewards. And people in it, because they're not rewarded for accurate predictions or anticipation, they're not doing it. And it's very hard to change it.
Talked a lot about sort of approaches to predictions. We were wondering if, just value for our readers and watchers, is there sort of a prediction that you can talk to that you've done in the past without giving away, information about the client, who it was for, but yeah, just a prediction that you've done in the past and sort of how you actually approached it for your work?
Sure. I'll give you 2 examples. One where I completely bombed it and totally missed it, because I think those are more sort of interesting. Because you can always talk about, I did this right. For the things that you missed it, you will not really learn and improve. One on that, and one I was different from the crowd, and I end up being right. The crowd being wrong on why I think that. Start with the second one, and this was the question on Turkish presidential election back in 2018, I think, and whether it would result in the first round or not. Was kind of the question, and there was a lot of comments within the forum that was going on when I was forecasting the question. I was around 90% saying that it will result in the first round, and Recep Tayyip Erdogan will be president. And a lot of pushback comes from, well, this is what the polls suggest, and no, this is how it goes. And, yeah, so a lot of very rational arguments. My approach was different, partly because I thought the way I approach it was not so much what are the objective conditions under which to go one way or another, what would the poll say, etc. But what are the incentives for Erdogan to make sure that things didn't go to the second round? Given sort of the whole history, my argument is practically that he cannot afford to lose, and he cannot even afford this to go to the second round, given the whole corruption and the political oppression debates and everything else that goes on in Turkey. So it's not your grandmother's election in Annexes. This is a guy who cannot afford to lose, and therefore he would do everything in his power, legal or illegal, to maintain that. So the results will be, whether they are accurate representation of people's will or not, results will be as such that he will win in the first round, which turns out to be the case. But my approach was more of, rather than, and this is an interesting aside word, rather than your outside view, which is typically what argues for your base rate, is how these things have been generated. This is a very inside view. And I think the useful lesson there is those are guidelines when you read this. It's about keeping that balance and knowing when you need to shift towards the inside, when it is different now. Right? If everything follows the mean, if everything reverts to the mean all the time, there are no surprises. But the point is to identify conditions under which you need to, you need to focus on the inside more than the outside. So in that particular instance, it was beneficial for me to focus on that rather than overall. When you look at these sort of the question that I really sort of completely end up missing. One that primarily comes to mind is to do with the North Korean. The Trump Kim meeting. Will it happen or not? Which happened in Singapore. And there, for example, I was swayed by the crowd. And my initial thought was, while Trump was a showman, he'd like to do that, he probably would. So my initial forecast was, but then I engage with people, read their arguments, and go, no, it's not going to happen. It's this, and the defense department does that, and given the conditions over there, they're all flaky and would not go. And so I steadily decreased my forecast because I was convinced they're right. Trump wouldn't be able to pull this off. And up until the last minute, it almost shows that that's not going to happen. And I was like, yes, it flipped over, and we all got a horrible Briar score out of it because we were putting like, I don't know, 5%, 10%, that was happening, and then he flipped the table. Again, that is a good example of how it's looking at, again, balancing inside versus outside view and your own sort of way of thinking with the crowd engagement. I should have stick with my own, because my primary framework approaching high-level political decisions tend to be very individual-centric because of my background in political psychology and interest in decision makers react. So I should have stick with, okay, this is what we know about his personality, his modus operandi. The chances that he would try to pull something off should be more than your average American president. And I sort of suppressed that inclination and went with the crowd because I was convinced their arguments completely bombed out. But that again gave me a sense of where I need to correct and what I need to correct.
And have you learned of ways to sort of catch yourself, like, oh, like maybe in this case I should, because there are cases where like you do come up with your own idea and then you read someone else's like, oh wait, actually no, the crowd is definitely right. I would imagine on average over a long period of time, in general, going with the crowd is better. So then, yeah, have you like developed tricks to sort of for yourself mentally to sort of like go through like a checklist of almost like, is it good to change with the crowd? Do you have criteria for that?
Like a heuristic almost.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what I tend to do generally, if I'm facing with a crowd opinion that substantially differs than what I think should happen, I generally flip the question. Will I be convinced if I am of the opinion of the crowd, and the crowd is of the opinion of me, right? So I flip it. I flip it and try to see which seems to be more convincing. Will I be convinced by the crowd if the crowd is saying what I think it is, and my opinion is what the crowd think it is previously? So that gives you, okay, maybe my arguments are not as strong as I think it is, because once I take it as someone else's opinion, I tend to start thinking about, okay, what could be the weaknesses? How can we put, holes into this and sort of engage in a red teaming in that way, right? I try to defend the crowd's opinion as my own, in my opinion, and try to defeat the crowd's opinion as my former opinion. That generally is a good check, at least in my case, because it helps you to bring along the cognitive biases rather than fight against them, right? It helps you to bring along the cognitive biases because you are predisposed to prefer your explanation to others' explanation. It's easier to criticize others than criticize yourself. So if you have to project your thinking on others and then criticize theirs, it's easier to do that, and you will be more harsh. And that actually is better for you. So instead of fighting that urge, you actually bring it along. I find that quite useful. Flipping the tables and then going at my own prediction as if it is the crowd's prediction.
That's fascinating. We just have one more question, and then we're going to get into just a couple rapid fire ones. But the last question is, as we mentioned in the introduction, you have this Substack newsletter, Hindsight 2020. We were wondering about what the impetus was for starting that newsletter, how it's been going, and where you'd like your own project to go moving forward.
Excellent. Well, the impetus was actually not so much different than yours for starting this. It was more of a public ledger. And for me to put some of my predictions down in a more sort of longhand format, and organize or push myself to organize my thinking that sort of connects thinking about uncertainty, about geopolitics, about the future, publicly out there, so that I could be held accountable both for myself and others. So that was the primary thing. Making it out there obliges me to write about it, and right there, and seeing it there would force me to think more clearly about how my predictions go. So rather than keeping them in a private format with the judgment and others, I want to put some of them out there in that way to think more clearly. So that was my initial. And when I have the time, I want to move on with that. To first, I want to write more, but it's all about trade-off time and things to do. I want to write more, but I want to sort of expand that to a more regular, reports, in the sense that this is what I thought was going to happen last year. This is what happened, what I learned, how I learned, and then I move forward with a series of more larger, perhaps, pieces where I try to sort of bring more rigor into thinking a couple of years ahead, and combine sort of the more quantitative, probabilistic forecasting with what sometimes is called strategic foresight. Because I think there is a way, looked at recently with Public, also went in just similar way, you had to combine those things. One of the criticisms of Good Judgement and Superforecasting overall tends to be, well, you are not asking the questions that matter to the policymaker. The big questions, the hard questions, don't necessarily lend themselves into precise wording and probabilistic estimates. So the idea for me is to work more towards how can we ask the more interesting and hard questions and use the tools we have from probabilistic forecasting, from various premortems and victims, to answer those questions in a more precise manner, so that we are both accurate and relevant for policymakers. So that's the direction I want to take with that.
That's awesome. And I'm personally subscribed to your Substack, and there will be a link down below. The most recent post I really liked. That's the one that got me to subscribe. So now at the end of all of these interviews, we like to do a few rapid fire questions. Two of them are ones that we asked to Regina, but the other one is because I've heard the same word over and over and over again in the interview, called incentives in predictions. And I was wondering if you had taken a look at websites, including Metaculus, and if you thought their approach to having community points was a way to have proper incentives to push better forecasting, or do you think a better future is in platforms such as Kalshi, which allows money trading on event-based predictions?
Well, let me start with that. I think I'm agnostic, to be honest. One of the reasons I'm skeptical about the sort of the prediction markets structure, the money component, is the liquidity, is the availability or the depth of the market. It's very, even the most sort of the top ones, like the predicted in terms of political prediction market, very shallow. You can move a lot of things and there. So the idea that not becomes accurately predicting the particular outcome, but arbitration between different views on the market to make money. So it kind of sort of divergent. Incentives don't necessarily get money. So I'm skeptical of using making money through accurate predictions through a market style format. I think prediction markets have a role, but I'm skeptical in terms of whether that's a useful incentive. When I look at people who get into this way of thinking, in Meticulous, in Good Judgement Open, in other places that try to predict, I tend to see two incentives that drive people generally. One is an intrinsic. People like me, who does it not necessarily for the money, but to see whether what I think in the world works is actually working that way, right? So you drive some satisfaction from them. The others tend to be driven more by the competitive. It's more about external validation in the sense that it's a sport. It's you beat the competition. You're number one. You're in the top three. And so your drive is to compete with others. Now, do you really need money for that? It helps, but that won't be much to come through. So putting the same level of effort on some other endeavor would bring you more cash flow, most likely, rather than a few $100s or whatever you're going to win trying to do this. So no, it is more the social hierarchy component. I do this, I compete, I win. It's my competitive instinct that helps me to do it. And there, I think the community points might be a good incentive with the way Meticulous does, and because it gamifies it in a way. It provides that in a very public way of I am the top dog here. You see, kind of thing. And we are, as a species, a quite competitive species. We like to do it in teams. There's a reason why almost every culture have team sports of one way or another. We like to create those sort of hierarchies, and in that sense, it could help, I believe. But overall, how much it would attract others who are not driven either one of these two drives, I don't know. And whether that's a loss in terms of being more accurate in the future. In other words, would it matter when people who are either intrinsically or extrinsically geared towards making accurate forecasts are not involved? Would this be a loss? I don't know. That's a testable proposition. So I'm agnostic in the long term aspects of this, but I'm more partial to the gamification component rather than the prediction markets making money.
And just really quickly, I was wondering, do you think that, for instance, somebody who's at the top of the charts on Meticulous, do you feel like that achievement would translate then to doing similar work to what you do in terms of forecasting as a job? Like, could they use that as sort of almost like certification of their forecasting abilities, or do you think that the two skill sets are still, there's a chasm there?
The primary chasm there is, I think, convincing people that this actually matters for their livelihood, for the future of their business, for their well-being. What I see generally at the policy level, both in business and in government side, is people don't necessarily sort of wrap their mind around why making accurate predictions earlier is going to be good for their business, right? And it depends a lot on, of course, who you talk to. Again, I want to come back to the incentive structure. If your income, if your salary is not necessarily depending on being 5% more accurate than the other guy, I mean, you'll get if you're going to get your, regardless, you will not necessarily be interested in spending money on that. But for example, you are talking with an entrepreneur or a founder whose incentive is, who would be earning a lot more if he or she is slightly more accurate than the others. There's a lot of incentive to put money into that because that gives you the edge, right? But if you're talking about, I don't know, an HR person whose job is not to screw up rather than increase the company bottom line by 5%. Well, why would you want to risk of being singled out for being wrong if you are being precise, right? A lot of people prefer to be vaguely right than precisely wrong. and that's the incentive structure in a broad academia and a government and in the business sector. So it is always a uphill battle to identify why this is a good thing, why you actually benefit, your organization, your company, your department benefits from being more accurate about the future. Is always a bit of a uphill battle, I would say.
All right. And to close it off, you will now be asked to make 2 rapid-fire predictions, both of which were asked to Regina as well. Number 1, and this one, given your name, I think you would have a little bit of extra expertise. What is the likelihood that Putin annexes more territory in Eastern Europe, including the Balkans, in the next 5 years?
Less than 5%.
Less than 5%. And then what is the likelihood that we credibly detect alien life, defined as cellular life proto-organisms, in the next 10 years? Extraterrestrial. You can't. Alien gets at that, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that would include things in Mars and in various, moons of the Jupiter and everything else in between, in meteors and asteroids. And
yes, but it has to be current. It can't be past.
Oh, okay. So existing, continuing life rather than something that have existed a million years ago.
Let's do both.
Okay. So I think finding life that existed. So if it is the broader prediction that includes both of the classes in the next 10 years, I say 10 to 15% at least.
Okay.
If I need to give you a range, I'll give a range of 10 to 25%. And I'll tell you very briefly my reasoning behind it. More and more countries and private corporations are sending probes and space missions. So we are actually increasing the number of potential discovery sites. And Elon Musk is out to go to Mars, etc. I think would also kick off, including Bezos and others who are trying to do the space. So there will be an explosion of space exploration in the next 10 years that increases our potential to do so. And I think there are already signs with regards to the Mars, particularly, as well as some of the moons of Jupiter, that suggest that there was life at some point because of water. So I think we will tend to 5% chance that we will find something that exists. Now, continuing existing live cellular sort of structure, I will put that somewhere within the range of 2 to 4%, less than 5%. Partly because it's harder to you got to be at the exact right space. It might exist in one small part going on, and Mars is huge, so you might not necessarily land in the correct spot and stuff like that. And it is a lot naturally because it's a conjunction, right? It's a lot less likely than the other one to happen. So it's I would say it's less than 5%, more closer to the 3%.
All right. Well, we'll make sure to get back to you in 5 to 10 years. Let you know how those predictions did. Just for all of our watchers out here, you can find Balkan over at balkandevlen.com, at Balkan Devlen on Twitter, and his Substack link is h2020.substack.com. Anything else, Balkan, that you would like to plug for people can find you?
No, thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Thanks so much for all your time and your answers. It was a wonderful conversation. We definitely learned a lot.
I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and make sure to tune in next week for the second episode of the Global Guessing Weekly podcast. We don't think next week will be an interview. It'll be a discussion, most likely about our next episode of Metaculous Mondays. But then we are having a series of interviews we're trying to line up for the future. So much more to come over here. All right. Thank you, everybody. All right. And that'll be the ending of the recording.
Awesome.
Really.
All right. Thank you so much for having this time to sit down and talk to us.
It was a lot of fun.